This is more or less a new topic for me. I will be interested in the rationality of emotions elicited by fiction. Okay, and probably as many of you know, there is a sort of well-known conundrum or paradox in the literature about the emotions, about fiction, the so-called paradox of fiction. I will not address directly that paradox in the talk, but I will shortly present it briefly so that you know more or less what is at stake there. And why I don't want to address it directly is simply because I think that there are as many paradoxes of fiction as there are philosophers working on the paradox of fiction. Okay? Many different readings of that paradox, and I don't want to commit myself to a specific reading of it. I think it's more interesting to discuss the underlying phenomena without directly engaging with the argument. But for those of you who are not very familiar with the theme, here is one possible way of understanding the argument or the paradox as it is presented in Radford's classical discussion. First premise, we are genuinely moved by works of fiction. Emotions in response to fictional objects can be genuine, that is to say, we can have real emotions about them, whatever that may mean. Okay, but these are the real stuff, not quasi-emotions or whatever. Second premise, we do not believe that fictional objects exist. Okay, we believe that what is portrayed in works of fiction is non-actual in a sense. And third premise, genuine emotions in response to fictional objects require that one believes that these entities actually exist. Okay, that is to say, we are genuinely moved only by what we believe is actual. Okay, so that's one way of understanding what is at stake in Radford's classic discussion. In the literature that has followed this paper, we find a contrast that is often not very well made and at least not pursued in the discussion, but that I think is very important, is the contrast between one factual question, so to say, how can emotions be elicited by fiction, okay? That is to say, in particular, because we do not believe the relevant objects to exist, that's the factual question. And there is a more, let us say, epistemological question that has to do with the status of this emotion. Okay, is to say the question of whether such emotions, granted that they can be elicited, okay, whether these emotions can be rational under given circumstances. And I will focus exclusively on that second question in what follows. I will also exclusively focus on what is sometimes called in this literature the engagement context. That is to say, the context in which the subject interacts with the fiction, the work of fiction. Okay, not what happens later when he's, for instance, in the street after having seen an horror movie, etc., etc. Only my focus will be exclusively on what happens when we engage with fictional works. Okay. I will also exclusively focus on epistemic rationality. That is to say, I will not be interested in themselves very interesting questions regarding the prudential reasons one may have to engage with works of fiction and to respond emotionally to them. Okay? There are many authors, and that's a classical theme to say that we may have reasons to do so, in particular with regard to the cultivation of the virtues, to the capacity to engage in real life, etc., etc. So this is often an argument in favor of engaging with works of fiction, but in itself does not presuppose any claim about the rationality of this epistemic rationality responses to works of fiction. I will also leave aside the issue of the question, the ontological question, as to whether fictional entities and fictional situations in particular can instantiate value situations. I will briefly comment on that later. But we will see why this is important. Why is that so? Well, because actually in the literature on emotions and fiction, this is really not the topic. Okay, the topic is not whether it can be dangerous for Anna Karenina to be in such a situation, etc., etc. Okay, the focus is on rationality and not correctness of the responses. But at the end, I will come back to that issue on the basis of what we will have seen regarding the epistemology or the rationality of these responses. Okay, so that's more or less the goal to see what is at stake in these emotional responses to fiction and whether we can say that they are rational or not. So here is the structure of my presentation. So first, I will very briefly comment on the connection between emotions and values, in particular regarding the way I intended to understand it. It's not that all I will have to say about the connection between emotions and fiction is premised on that specific understanding of the connection between emotions and values, but still this is the way I tend to go, and I will couch all the discussion in those terms. But we will see that it's very easy to translate, so to say, what I will have to say in other frameworks. Then I will move on to the rationality of emotions, and I will distinguish two important aspects of that rationality. One that I will describe as upstream, which has to do with the cognitive basis of the emotion. We will see what is at stake here. And one that I will describe as downstream, which has to do with the judgments and behavior that are typically elicited by these emotional responses. And on the basis of that distinction regarding the rationality of emotions in general, that is to say, I will apply these lessons to three types of emotions elicited by our interactions with fiction, and see whether we can assess them as irrational. Because the suspicion, of course, in this literature, post-Radford and in Radford himself, is that they are actually irrational responses, or irrational responses, something like this. Okay. So first, the emotion-value connection. I guess that this is quite, due to the presence of Christine, quite familiar to most of you here. So a very schematic way of looking at the sorts of approaches to the emotions we find in the history of the topic, but also in the current literature. You have the non-cognitive emotion theory, the feeling theory in particular, the idea that emotions are just non-intentional feelings, that they represent absolutely nothing, that they are not subject to rationality constraints of any kind. Then you have the James Lange theory, the idea that emotions are just bodily feelings. And then on the side of the cognitive approaches, let us say more or less intentional approaches, the idea that emotions are directed to the words and therefore subject to standards of appropriateness and rationality. You have the three classic options, two classic options and one that I favor, let us say it that way. The classic emotion as judgment approach, so fearing that P is just believing that P is dangerous. The approach favored, for instance, by Christine Tapollet, the idea that emotions are perceptions of values. And the third one that I will briefly sketch here, the idea that emotions are evaluative attitudes. Okay. So to comment briefly on that, the idea, of course, is to connect emotions and types of emotions with what is often described as their formal objects, which are properties that play very significant roles in the understanding of the nature of these mental states. And in particular, these values allow us to individuate the different types of emotions. So the idea is that, for instance, fear is that emotion, that emotional response, which has to do with danger or threatening, etc. That anger is that response that has to do with the offense, etc., etc. So you individuate the types of emotions with the help of that property, and of course, at the same time, you use that same property to at least partly describe or specify the correctness conditions of these responses. That is to say, fear would be correct only if and only if something is dangerous, the object of fear is dangerous, something, an episode of anger will be appropriate if and only, or correct if and only if something is an offense, etc., etc. Okay? So all this is more or less, I would say, common ground in all the approaches that favor that claim that there is an intimate connection between emotions and evaluative properties, but it leaves it completely open how we should understand that link. Okay, what's the nature of the link between these two types of entities, emotions on the one hand and evaluative properties on the other hand. So the approach that I favor has to do with, or can be understood in terms of a series, that will be enough for today, or a series of parallels between different claims that many philosophers have made regarding different types of mental states, in which we find similar claims as the ones we find in the literature about the emotions. So many philosophers have claimed, for instance, that belief relates to truth as its formal object, that conjecture relates to probability as its formal object. And one other example of such a connection is the connection between supposition, or imagining that, and possibility. Okay, that's three central claims that have been made in the literature, and that are similar to this claim that fear relates to danger and so on. But it's important to note here, okay, is that these claims relate to mental states as types, not as tokens. Okay, the claim is that in all instances of fear, okay, you have the relation with danger. In all cases of belief, you have a relation to truth. In all cases of supposition, you have a relation to. And why is that so? Well, because the idea here is that those properties help us understand what many different instances of the same mental state have in common, and this even though they differ regarding their contents. Okay? So the idea is that this relation to truth, to focus on the case of belief, is what all beliefs have in common, despite the fact that their contents can be whatever you want them to be. Okay, you can believe too much. The same, of course, will be true for the emotion. And on the other hand, it serves also to explain how mental state with the same content may have different correctness conditions. So, for instance, when you believe that P, and I only suppose that P. Okay, because of these different attitudes or modes, okay, our mental states come to have different correctness conditions, even if they represent the same thing, they are about the same things. Okay? So the idea here is that this notion of formal object, that this notion of formal object can help us elucidate the nature of types of attitudes. So here is roughly the idea. Pierre believes that P, if and only if he has towards P an attitude that is correct if and only if P. He conjectures that P, if and only if he has towards P an attitude that is correct if and only if it is probable, and so on and so forth. Okay? For all types of attitudes. And the important point, but this is not essential for today, but let's, as I said, I've coached the discussion in those terms. What is important to observe is that here, the idea is that these attitudes, okay, play or have an important role, have a substantial role in the fixation of the correctness conditions, despite the fact that they do not feature in the content of the mental states. Okay, so that's the idea. It's because you conjecture that P that your mental state is correct if P is probable. Not because you represent P as being probable. Okay? That's the idea. And to apply that to the emotions, the idea is just that emotions are attitudes towards content, and the idea in the case of fear would be to say, well, fearing A is having an attitude towards A, which is correct if and only if A is dangerous. Okay, so that's the idea, and the same lesson applies also in this case. Okay, the relation with the formal object has nothing to do with representation, but rather with the fact that there is a given mental mode. Of course, this is not to give a specific account of what these modes or attitudes are. I will not do that here because we do not need anything more precise to discuss the cases of emotions elicited by fiction. The only thing I will presuppose is that these attitudes, these emotional reactions, if you want to put it that way, contribute in the way sketched to the correctness conditions of the mental states. That is to say, they endow these mental states with specific evaluative correctness conditions. I will also presuppose, and this will have a very important role to play in what follows, that these attitudes or modes are based on other mental states, and that this explains why we typically ask reasons for emotions. So, for instance, your fear of the dog is based on your visual perception of the dog. Okay, your anger at a given remark is based on your auditory perception of the given remark, and so on and so forth. So, we call in these two cases the visual presentation or the auditory presentation the cognitive base of an emotion. The cognitive base of an emotion can be also a mere belief, a supposition, an episode of remembering, and so on and so forth. Okay, you can base your emotion on very different types of mental states. I will also presuppose that these emotions inherit at least part of their contents from their cognitive basis. The idea is also here very intuitive. The idea is that you are afraid of what you see. Okay, you are angry at what you are hearing, and so on and so forth. Okay, at least in the standard cases. And as we shall see, okay, it is this basing relation between other kinds of mental states and the emotions will play a very important role when we assess the rationality of emotions in general and in the case of fiction in particular. So let's turn now to the rationality of emotions. As I announced, for today we can very roughly, I would say, distinguish two issues. Okay, what happens upstream of the emotion, so the relations between the emotion and its base, like the visual perception of the dog and the episode of fear, for instance. And what happens, so that's on the one hand, and what happens downstream on the other hand, that is to say the relation between this emotion and the judgments and behavior that this emotion typically, or in the given circumstances, elicits. So, of course, what happened upstream is extremely important to assess the rationality of emotions, because whether or not a subject is rational in having an emotion is, in a substantial part, okay, a function of the mental states on which this emotion is based. Okay, it's pretty much like in the case of belief. You can have completely crazy reasons for why you end up believing something. In the same way, you can have completely bad reasons for ending up fearing something or being angry at somebody, and so on and so forth. So typically, we assess on a daily basis subjects the rationality of an emotion in the light of the sorts of reasons, okay, that explain why a subject ends up having this emotional attitude towards an object. So also important to note that given the fact that emotions have this intimate relation to evaluative properties, the cognitive basis of an emotion will have somehow to connect with these evaluative properties. Okay, so a very strong claim would be to say that some philosophers they are quite rare, but still defend, would be to say, well, in order to be afraid, you have to feel the danger of the dog before you fear it. Okay? That's only one option. There are other options, which would be, for instance, to say, well, you can have beliefs about properties, natural or non-natural, of the object, and these have, for instance, to be reliable indications of the presence of a given value, so that when they cause an emotion, they at the same time allow it to be a rational response. Okay, there are various options, but here the only claim I will presuppose is that there is, in one way or another, a connection with the relevant evaluative property. Okay? Because intuitively speaking, because you take an attitude towards something that is correct only if the thing is dangerous, okay, and you take it on the basis of other mental states that are about this object, it would be better for these other mental states about the object to give you some information, some indication at least that the object has the relevant value, so that, okay, your reaction makes sense, is rational, is appropriate. But of course you find there all the sorts of options you find anywhere else in epistemology. You can be externalist, internalist, coherentist, foundationalist, whatever you want. Okay, but the idea is just that there is such a connection. So that's for what happens upstream. What happens downstream? It's also important, of course, to observe that what happens downstream the emotion is also very important to assess the rationality of the subject's emotion. Okay, of course, the sorts of judgments that a subject will make on the basis of his emotion, the sorts of behaviors the way he will behave in the light of his emotions, will also be very important in order to assess whether his response is rational or not. Okay, that's what happens downstream. So two questions: does the emotion provide a reason for toto, pro tanto, to act in this way? Does it justify judging the subject's judging that a given object or situation has a given value? Okay, so that's more or less the situation. You have the cognitive base. You can ask yourself the question: is the cognitive base a good reason for the emotion? That's upstream. Downstream, is the emotion a good reason for the action or for the judgment? Illustration is just with the judgment, with the behavior here. An example: perception of the lion, fear, running away situation, very basic situation in which I hope you would agree that, at least for usual standard human beings, fear would be the problem. Okay. So that is to say, there are two ways, okay, that subjects can manifest their irrationality in connection with an emotion. Okay, and what I want to explore today is just whether there are reasons to think that what happens in connection with fiction, the sort of emotional responses we give to fiction, okay, allows us to say that there is something distinctive there that makes it the case that the subject is systematically irrational in responding to fiction in the way he does. Okay. That's the question. It's not easy to address this question because we have to somehow to keep track of the very different kinds of emotional responses that can be elicited by fiction. Okay, there are very different types of emotions that are elicited in our interactions with works of fiction. I will use a very crude tripartite distinction in what follows. There are many shades in between. I will just for today distinguish three types of emotions. What I will call aesthetic emotions. I will go very fast with them because they don't create any sort of problem. What I will call blob-like emotions, second, and then the emotions for. Okay, and we will see that there are very different kinds of emotional responses, in particular as regards the way we should rationally assess them. So if you are familiar with the literature, you will see that I have not addressed, I have not a distinctive category there for those emotions that are directed towards non-fictional objects, okay, but that are typically elicited by fiction. So the standard case would be you watch an horror movie, you go out in the streets, and then you are afraid of almost everything, okay? Here, the interaction with fiction play an eliciting role, but the emotion is not directed towards the fiction. And so it's not a case that interests me because I want to focus on the rationality of emotions that are, okay, directed at fictional objects. That's what is at stake in Radford's paradox of fiction and in the literature until now. So what about the aesthetic emotions? Also two very standard cases: admiration for work of art, disgust for a film saturated with ideological references. Okay, two examples of strong aesthetic emotions. These ones are really not, I would say, not problematic and not what is at stake in the issue about the rationality of emotions. Why? Because in that case, the assessment of the rationality of these emotions will have to do with whether the properties that the subject perceive in the artwork give reason for a specific emotional response. Okay, that's correct, for instance, if and only if in the case of admiration, if and only if the painting is admirable. Okay. And this will downstream, have also to do with whether all things being equal, of course, with whether the emotional response gives rise to judgment and behavior that is appropriate, justified in the light of this emotional response. In the case of a response of admiration, you could think that further exploration of the object, okay, maintained cognitive contact with the object would be an appropriate response to a beautiful object, something like this. So nothing very particular in this case, okay? You have exactly the same sequence as in any standard case of emotion, that is to say, directed towards standard objects. The only issue is whether as for any kind of value, whether these aesthetic values do exist, etc. But we'll not go into that today. Okay, exactly the same sequence, and nothing peculiar to these cases that should tempt us to say, well, there is something bizarre, strange, irrational in the responses subjects have in regard to fiction. That is to say, in these aesthetic emotion responses. So that's the first category. Second category, which I've called the blob-like emotions, so that we understand why these are. This is the standard case. Okay, you see that sort of thing on the screen. Okay, and you are afraid. Okay.
What is it?
It's the blob, actually. No, it's horrifying. I mean, it's I can't sleep since 3 nights because of it. But it's the original blob.
Ah, it is.
So these emotions, I think, they are the emotions that spring to mind when people think of irrational responses to fiction. Okay, being afraid of that kind of thing that's just projected on the screen. And they actually have played a very, very significant role in the literature regarding the paradox of fiction, etc. This is, I think, the main source for the claim that there is something amiss in our emotional reactions to fiction. But I think that this role is completely legitimate, just because, as a matter of fact, okay, these emotions have nothing in particular to do with works of fiction, okay, first, much more general responses, as I will suggest, and second, that they do not manifest the subject's irrationality in any interesting sense. So 2 reasons not to focus on them in a discussion of the rationality of emotions related to fiction. So why what are these responses? I think John Day's discussion in cognitivism and the emotions, in the theory of emotions, is a good source to understand the nature of these responses. They are what Day describes as natural responses to relatively fixed stimuli. Okay, very rigid responses that are in particular completely mostly impervious to the subjects, to the evidence that may be at the subject's disposal. Okay, so you have these very standard examples, like the case of the stick of wood in the shape of a snake in the grass, and you're afraid. It's like sort of illusion or hallucination. Okay, you can know that the thing is not a snake, but just the appearance, the visual appearance strikes you as a snake, and you become afraid. So these sorts of what is often called more or less modular emotions, you have very, for what they are worth, very quite a number of evolution-related explanation for why we have such responses. Of course, it's better to respond with false positives to those kinds of situations, so that you really avoid the cases where you have snakes, so that you don't die. Okay, that sort of responses. But the important point for us is that all these responses, okay, even when they and especially when they take place in relation to fiction, okay, they are parasitic upon these sorts of natural responses we have to very fixed types of stimuli. And of course, in Hollywood and in other places, people know very well how to tap into the specific sorts of stimuli. But in those cases, of course, it's projected on the screen, okay? The visual presentation gives no reason for the subject to be afraid. There is actually no danger, okay? And the subject typically concurs, okay? Of course, okay? They know that they have nothing to be afraid of at the movies. But that does not reveal any kind of irrationality on their part. Okay, why? Well, because actually the subject just cannot control, okay, the occurrence of the emotion in those cases. That is to say, subjects cannot manifest their rationality upstream because the connection between stimuli and response is relatively fixed and relatively impervious to evidence. Okay, it would be the same sort of mistake to assess somebody as irrational. More or less the same mistake, because he cannot help to see the Müller-Lyer illusion as if the subjects were, the two lines were of different lengths. And if it seems to me that this is the way to go, if by irrational we mean something more substantial, or different at least, from incorrect. Okay? Well, the only way for a subject to manifest the rationality in those cases is, of course, to block the usual consequences on judgment and behavior of a fear response, an anger response, or whatever the response is at stake. This is typically the case, okay? People don't run out of theaters, they stay in their seats, etc. They don't judge that there is a danger, okay? Everything is fine and well, okay? No irrationality here at all. Right, you cannot manifest rationality there, but you do not run away and so on. You do not make the relevant judgments. Everything is fine as far as your rationality is concerned. They are also not very significant, apart except if you are a big fan of horror movies, okay, these sorts of emotional responses are not typical of reading novels or of engaging with other sorts of movies and so on and so forth. But what is important is that there has been, in much of the literature, a very exclusive focus on them. And the consequence of that is not innocuous. It's the fact that, or the idea that the rationality of emotions in general, and in response to fiction in particular, is manifested always in the way it is manifested in these cases, if it is. That is to say, only downstream. Okay? Because in these cases, of course, you cannot do anything but just be afraid of the blob. But this is completely wrong, of course. Okay, as I think we have good reason to believe that the rationality of an emotion is primarily manifested in the connection, in the upstream connection, that is to say, between the sorts of cognitive basis you have for a response and the response you end up having. Okay, so it will completely distort the domain to insist on these sorts of responses and to say, well, the subject irrationality or rationality has only to be assessed in terms of whether he judges or behaves in a given way. So that's for the second category of emotions. No reason to end up claiming that the subject, that we are typically irrational in these cases too. Third category of emotions, the emotions for, you can say. That's why I fear for Mike, as he is pursued by the blob, for instance, or given her plight, Michel is sad for Anna Karenina. Okay, these are the standard examples. And these, so that's the, yeah, that's Anna Karenina. Yeah, she's there at the end, just after the blob. So these, I think, are the central and the most interesting cases of our engagement with fiction. And the first observation to make is that in these cases, the full sequence, okay, is restored. It's not like with the blob-like emotions, okay? So here, as cognitive basis, I put a belief with a fictional operator in the content. If we have 5 minutes at the end of the discussion, I will explain why I favor that option over other options, but suppose that it's correct for the moment. You have the belief that in the fiction P, okay, in the fiction Anna Karenina faces a dramatic period of her life, she has lost everything, etc., etc. Sadness, those beliefs justify the emotion, and then the sort of behavior, maybe or maybe not elicited, so the two same kind of questions that we had for the other types of emotions. So, are these emotions for typically, systematically irrational? What happened upstreams does not seem to warrant such a conclusion. Okay? The emotion here is typically sensitive to evidence, okay, in the form of belief, in the case of novels that would be typically the case, or perception-like states, in the case of watching a movie. Okay? And they are, of course, modulated by the information given there in the fiction. Okay? You will not feel sad for Anna, were it not for the information that she suffers a terrible period of her life. So that's completely different from the blob-like emotions, but it's not to say that there are not many cases of emotions for that are irrational. Okay? So one typical mistake people make when they are very, very inattentive would be, for instance, in the case of the movie The Blob. Okay, you fear for Mike, but actually John is pursued by the blob. It's not Mike. Okay, standard mistake. Okay, the emotion is manifest your irrationality in this case, or your inattentiveness, etc. And the important point, of course, is also another important observation is that you have often movements between emotions for and blob-like emotions. Okay, you can feel afraid for a character in a movie, and suddenly you start to look under the sofa behind you whether there is something dangerous there, etc. Okay, but let us and that would be an irrational response, of course. Okay. But let us concentrate there in the cases of emotions for. Okay, in the sofa case, an emotion for creates or elicits an emotion, not for a fictional character, but a more mundane case of fear. Okay, let's concentrate on these cases of emotion for. Do they manifest a systematic kind of irrationality? And here we come back to actually one aspect of Radford's discussion that was almost typically forgotten afterwards, is that in his discussion Radford focused on what happened upstream in those cases and contrasted these cases of emotion for with the cases of emotions not for a fictional character. And he argued, or he suggested at least, that the fact that, for instance, Michel in our case maintains his emotion for Anna even if he is appraised of the fact that she does not exist, okay, reveals his irrationality. So that's one intuition that many people have in connection with that specific type of emotional response to fiction. And one may wonder why. Okay, why is that the case? I would like to have a reason for that. Okay, and remember, I left until now the ontological worry aside. So don't answer, well, it's because Anna cannot face a situation which is a loss, or John cannot face a dangerous situation when he's pursued by the blob, etc. That's irrelevant for now. And that's irrelevant for the discussion actually in Radford and the literature. The underlying worry, I think, of irrationality is that the subject, or we generally, treat our emotions for fictional entities, like Anna, completely differently than we do for our emotions for non-fictional entities. So for instance, if I am sad for the man at the Créon who suffers intolerable heat in his office, for instance, okay, and well, my emotion will disappear if suddenly I am appraised of the fact that there's no one in this office. Actually, the room is empty. And the question is, so how can Michel persist to feel sad for Anna once appraised of the fact that she does not exist? Okay, that's the relevant discrepancy, and that's a manifestation of irrationality. But I think, in the light of what we said, we saw at the beginning, this is actually a precondition of the rationality of his response of fear or sadness for Anna, that his response reacts to information, to incoming information, to information of this type, differently than it does in the case of an emotion for a real person. Okay? So why is that the case? So it's completely wrong to argue in that way in the light of this. So we have seen that emotions have this variety of different cognitive bases, and of course must be modulated by the relevant evidence. Okay? So if Michel's emotion is directed at what happens to Anna in the fiction, of course, this emotion should be sensitive to evidence for or against the presence of the relevant situation in the fiction. Okay, it would be completely wrong to appeal to other kind of information, to information that has not to do with the fiction itself. Okay, that relates to what happens, so to say, outside the fiction. And why is the case? Well, because if his sadness for Anna disappeared once he became appraised of the fact that Anna does not exist, that she is a fictional entity created by a writer, this would show actually that the base of her emotion is mistaken. Okay? That would show, for instance, that her emotion is based on a belief that Anna Karenina is, for instance, say, a report of 19th century Russia like a newspaper. Okay? That's actually not the case. So how can we argue that this shows, this manifests irrationality. On the contrary, it's presupposed by the rationality of her response that she reacts to incoming information in that way. Okay? So there is absolutely no reason to move out, so to say, of such a combination of mental states. Anna Karenina does not exist, and I feel afraid, or I feel sad for what's happening to her. That's for what happens upstream. For what happens downstream, okay, no specific issue there. What happens downstream in these cases of emotion 4 is typically modulated by the nature of the relevant basis. There are exceptions, okay? There are all these people who, for instance, make a confusion between actors and their roles, okay? And that have surely very irrational emotions or very irrational types of behavior based on their emotions for characters. Okay, that's, I hope, not the case in this room, so it's a very specific kind of case, and typically emotions for fictional character do not have such behavioral or judgmental consequences. Okay. So that is to say that at least in these three standard cases of emotional reactions to fiction, we have no reason to think that there is a systematic disruption of rationality at stake. Okay? There should be different, in a sense, standards of rationality, for instance, in the case of the emotions 4, okay, because they should manifest for fictional entities, because they should they should react to information about the fiction, okay, but they have no systematic connection with irrationality. So briefly, I said that in the case of emotions 4 in particular, because I think that the interesting consequences have to do with emotions 4, the content is that in the fiction A is F. Okay, so the modal operator is within the content of a belief, okay, according to the approach that I favored. There is an alternative, and the alternative has to do with it's quite standard in the literature on fiction and emotions, emotional reactions to fiction. It has to do with the appeal to different types of attitudes and keeping the content constant. Okay, one does not appeal to the belief that in the fiction A is F, but rather to the pretense or the supposition that A is F. Okay, that is to say, you do not say, well, the subject believes that in the fiction Anna Karenina suffers, etc., but rather to the supposition that Anna Karenina suffers. Okay? Someone suffers. And then you can lay emphasis on the different normative constraints bearing on belief and supposition, or pretense to account for the distinction between the two cases. Now this appeal to imagination surely requires much more discussion, but here are, I think, two of the main reasons to resist going in that direction. The first one is that it seems to me that there is nothing putative, hypothetical, provisional in the relevant attitudes directed towards the fictional character. It's not that I do as if Anna Karenina was facing a dangerous or sad situation. I believe that in the fiction she was sad. So I commit myself to something that in the fiction it's the case that peak. Okay? It's different from a pretense or a supposition. And I think that in any case, okay, the belief versus pretending contrast applies in fiction as well as in non-fiction cases. Okay, that is to say that you can believe or pretend that A is F, and you can believe or pretend that in the fiction A is F. And these are four different cases we should not mix with one another, in particular because they will typically elicit different types of emotions in the two cases. So briefly say, why is this approach so attractive to many? I think just because intuitively it's true, it's the case that it seems that imagination plays an important role, okay, in our engagement with works of fiction. But I think it's wrong to say that it's pretending or supposing that that has this important role. It's rather imaginative recreation, sensory imagining that is very important in many engagement with fiction. And if you go into that direction, actually the contrast between presence and absence of imagination, in the sense of sensory imagining, does not map well into the contrast between emotion elicited in real versus fictional context. Okay, just because you need also typically visual imagination to elicit emotions in the case of newspaper reports, for instance. Okay, so information that is purely given in written form, okay, typically will not elicit an emotion, if there is no imagination at play. Okay, and this actually suggests that the relation between sensory imagination and emotions has rather to do with the first question I spoke about at the beginning. How can emotions be elicited by fiction? Okay, rather than with the question how can emotions elicited by fiction be rational. Okay, that's an issue about whether we need imagination, in particular sensory imagination, to react emotionally to fiction. Well, okay, so I need 3 minutes. So if that's correct, and as I said, it's not enough to convince you if you committed surely to that claim about imagination, but suppose that that goes in the right direction, and that the relevant contents are contents of belief in the case of emotion 4, and they are the content that in the fiction A is F. There is a very short argument to suggest that will need to be argued for, of course, and to be developed, but here is an interesting argument in the neighborhood, I think, to show that if you do not defend a sort of unpalatable error theory about fiction, you will have the consequence that many emotions towards fiction, emotions for are appropriate. So here's the argument, very broad outline. Contents such as in the fiction A is F can be true. Okay, why? Well, because an error theory about all that happens in fiction is clearly absurd. Okay. It'd be very bizarre to say, well, in the fiction, it's not the case. It's wrong to think that in the fiction, Anna Karenina faces a sad situation. Okay. It's very bizarre to think that all our beliefs are wrong. So, if so, this means that in the fiction, A is F, okay, and then you have the very controversial premise, okay. If A being F is a value situation for A, then fictional A being F in the fiction is a value situation for fictional A. Okay? So, an emotion directed towards fictional A, which is correct if and only if V can be appropriate. And actually, I think that this. I think I will stop here. We can go that in the discussion. Thank you. Thank you.
Je vais peut-être commencer par une des questions qui me frappait. Tu disais que, et j'ai tendance à être d'accord avec toi, que les émotions pour Anna Karenine et autres ne venaient pas forcément avec des motivations, des actions. C'est un débat. Certains pensent que du fait qu'il n'y a pas d'action liée à ce genre d'émotions, ce ne sont pas vraiment des émotions, ce sont des quasi-émotions. Je voulais t'entendre plus là-dessus, mais surtout du point de vue de quelqu'un qui défend la théorie attitudinale, dont je crois me souvenir qu'elle affirme quelque part que les émotions sont ce que vous appelez des felt action tendencies, des tendances à l'action ressentie, c'est plus difficile, me semble-t-il, de couper le lien avec la motivation et de parler d'émotions réelles s'il n'y a pas de action tendencies, vraiment, quand on a pitié d'Anna Karénine ou quelque chose de ce genre.
Alors, ok, donc je n'ai pas présupposé effectivement cette théorie. Donc, une fois qu'on a c'est-à-dire la différence entre attitude et contenu et qu'on considère que le rapport à la valeur à avoir avec l'attitude par opposition avec le contenu, encore s'agit-il de caractériser la nature de ces attitudes pour pouvoir faire sens de ce rapport à la valeur. Alors, il est vrai que moi, j'ai tendance à défendre une thèse selon laquelle il y a un rapport à la motivation ou à la préparation actionnelle qui explique ce rapport à la valeur. Alors, dans ce cas, je pense, c'est pour ça que, si tu veux, si on reprend les schémas qu'on avait ici, par exemple, pour prendre celui-ci, alors, si on opte pour une approche comme celle-ci, il faut encore se poser une deuxième question. Là, j'ai posé que la question qui a à voir avec le comportement effectif et avec le jugement effectif. D'accord ? Donc, dans ces cas-là, je suis d'accord pour dire que lorsque le comportement est vraiment déclenché, il y a une forme d'irrationalité et on va devoir condamner rationnel. D'un point de vue rationnel, c'est la réponse qui a déclenché. La question, c'est si on en reste à une tendance actionnelle, tout comme on est dans la même situation, si tu veux, que dans le cas d'une impression visuelle qui, pour beaucoup de philosophes, donne une certaine tendance à juger. Okay. Est-ce que cette tendance à émettre un jugement est en elle-même la manifestation de l'irrationalité du sujet, ou est-ce que lorsqu'il la bloque, comme dans le cas du Müller d'ailleurs, on peut vouloir faire la distinction entre la correctitude ou incorrectitude du contenu d'un côté, et puis la rationalité de l'autre, et puis que dans ce cas-là, eh bien, le fait que la tendance jugementale est bloquée fait que le sujet ne manifeste pas son irrationalité. Donc, une possibilité, ce serait de dire, non, dans le cas d'une émotion et d'une tendance actionnelle, le fait qu'un sujet ne déclenche pas son émotion, le comportement lié ou le type de comportement lié à l'émotion, fait que cette réponse, cette tendance actionnelle ressentie n'est pas irrationnelle dans les circonstances. Je pense qu'il y a une place pour défendre un truc comme ça. La première question...
C'était ça en fait.
Oui, il y avait une autre question plus large.
Vraiment
oui,
moi j'avais ça en tête.
Ah bon
disons savoir, oui, c'est pas vraiment une émotion s'il n'y a pas l'action.
Voilà, oui, alors ça c'est encore un autre point.
C'est la même question.
C'est-à-dire, la littérature sur ce sujet que je connais assez mal, je dois dire, il y a une tendance à dire vraiment le fait que le comportement n'est pas déclenché fait que l'émotion n'est pas là. Dans le cas du standard du gars au cinéma avec le blob, l'argument était de dire non mais si vous avez vraiment peur, vous sortez du cinéma. Vous ne restez pas là même. Jamais vraiment compris cet argument. C'est bien que je veux dire, même s'il y a un rapport étroit entre émotion et motivation, ça me semble vraiment faux d'attribuer l'émotion sur la base de la manifestation de cette tendance actionnelle. À partir du moment après, alors la question c'est est-ce qu'on a des cas d'émotions déclenchées dans des contextes fictionnels toi, tu as tendance à dire ça, me semble-t-il, qui n'implique même pas la tendance actionnelle, alors là, je suis d'accord pour dire que dans ces cas-là, il y aura un problème pour une théorie qui veut comprendre les attitudes dans ces termes-là. Mais disons, tel que ça figure dans la littérature sur les émotions et la fiction, c'est plutôt le output comportemental en lui-même qui était la cible, quoi. Et ça paraît un peu moins convaincant.
Je me demande comment on pourrait savoir s'il y a vraiment une tendance à l'action. Il faudrait mettre ces gens dans des scanners, peut-être.
Ça va se faire, ça se fait,
se fait,
ça c'est en train de se
ça se
faire.
fait.
C'est écologiquement, c'est peu valide. Une autre question.
Merci. Je voulais te demander, justement à propos de ce qui est affiché au tableau en ce moment, la partie tout en bas de la chaîne causale, la question Is the emotion a good reason for acting? Est-ce que tu pourrais élaborer sur quel rôle tu attribues aux émotions dans ce domaine-là? Parce qu'il me semble que dans le type de cas paradigmatique que tu as décrit, il ne me semblait pas vraiment approprié de dire que l'émotion elle-même fournit une raison à la personne d'agir. Par exemple, personne qui se balade en forêt, puis qui voit un ours qui a peur, est-ce qu'on va dire que c'est son émotion de peur qui lui fournit une raison d'agir? A priori pas. A priori, ce qui fournit une raison d'agir, c'est le fait qu'il y a un ours et qu'il est dangereux. Donc pour protéger sa survie, il y a une raison de courir. Maintenant, on peut trouver des exemples, je suis d'accord, où on pourrait dire que c'est l'émotion elle-même fournit une raison d'agir. Si quelqu'un est au cinéma et il trouve que Le Blob est un film absolument terrible et qu'il est traumatisé, bon, peut-être que l'émotion de peur excessive lui donne une raison de partir avant la fin du film. Mais je ne sais pas si c'est ce genre de scénario-là que tu avais à l'esprit.
Non.
Il me semblait que c'était plutôt le premier type, donc tu pourrais en dire plus.
Oui. Non, alors, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec toi aussi pour dire, alors là ça pose un problème assez lourd, disons, en théorie des émotions. Parce que, si tu veux, il y a deux écoles qui s'affrontent. Une école qui dirait, qui mettrait vraiment l'accent sur ce que j'ai appelé au début, et ensuite les bases cognitives de l'émotion, n'est-ce pas? Où on aurait l'idée que la peur en elle-même, comme tu l'as dit, n'est pas une raison, mais elle ne justifie que de manière indirecte le sujet, pour autant qu'elle-même soit une réponse à de bonnes raisons. Donc, par exemple, l'ours peut être une bonne raison, la présence d'un ours peut être une bonne raison de fuir ou d'avoir peur. Tu accèdes par le biais, par exemple, d'une perception visuelle à la présence de cet ours. Cette présence de l'ours déclenche une émotion. Et le rapport dont tu parles ici, en fait, la manière dont l'émotion peut fonctionner comme une base, une justification du comportement, est entièrement dérivée du fait qu'elle-même repose sur des raisons. Alors moi, c'est le genre d'approche que je favorise plutôt. Mais il y a d'autres approches qui considèrent que les émotions, si tu veux, donnent elles-mêmes des raisons parce qu'elles rajoutent une certaine couche informative à la situation. Par exemple, Christine, ce serait une approche un petit peu comme ça que tu favoriserais bien. Dans le sens où, c'est-à-dire on aurait l'idée, ou peut-être pas dans ton approche mais dans d'autres, que eh bien, il y a les raisons, donc il y a la présence de l'ours, mais ça, la présence d'un ours, c'est pas encore une raison d'agir ou d'avoir peur, ou de fuir. Ce qu'il faut fuir, c'est une situation dangereuse. Okay?
Absolument.
Et puis, si tu considères maintenant que la réponse affective a pour rôle de te représenter la situation comme dangereuse, sous l'aspect du danger, alors de cette manière-là, tu pourrais te tenter de dire qu'elle joue ce rôle de te permettre d'accéder à la dangerosité de la situation qui est une raison de fuir, et donc elle a en elle-même ce rôle justificateur. Mais je suis d'accord avec toi pour dire qu'il y a clairement une place pour l'idée selon laquelle ce lien-là est entièrement dérivé de ce qui se passe en amont. Ouais.
Merci. J'avoue que j'ai des difficultés à accepter l'idée que tu venais de décrire que l'émotion elle-même rajoute une couche, ajoute à la somme des raisons qu'a la personne. Donc ça voudrait dire que le randonneur qui est ignorant, peut-être qu'on l'a mal informé, peut-être qu'on lui a dit « Ah oui, il y a Marcel Béliveau qui fait des canulars dans cette région, alors Il y a des gens qui sont déguisés en ours, qui terrorisent les promeneurs. Donc ils voient un ours qui est vraiment dangereux, il n'a pas peur, il pense que c'est un canular. Cette personne a moins de raisons de fuir et de protéger sa vie que la personne qui est bien informée sur les dangers. Ça me semble difficile à accepter.
Non, parce que tu lis les... Non, je suis d'accord, parce que tu lis les... Tu as vraiment la lecture totalement objective des raisons. C'est-à-dire, tu dis ce qui est pertinent dans ces circonstances-là, c'est des faits objectifs qui, s'ils constituent une menace pour le sujet, constituent effectivement de bonnes raisons pour lui de fuir la situation, etc. Je pense que tous les gens qui mettent l'accent sur le rôle de justification des émotions considèrent que on peut parler de justification que lorsqu'une contrainte d'accès à ces faits est réalisée par le sujet. Donc, peut-être une manière de le comprendre, c'est de dire il faut que on évalue ici et en amont le rapport entre une réponse et ses conséquences, et donc, du point de vue du sujet, et donc on présuppose que toutes ces séquences est évaluée exclusivement à la lumière d'une contrainte d'accès satisfaite. On ne peut pas discuter de la rationalité ou irrationalité des émotions, ou en tout cas de ce lien-là, si tu veux, indépendamment totalement d'une contrainte d'accès de la part du sujet.
Ah, c'est sûr, si la question c'est l'émotion est-elle rationnelle ou non, bien sûr, mais la question que je me posais c'était dans quelle mesure donne-t-elle des raisons d'agir? Donc les théoriciens en question vont dire que oui, elle ajoute, la personne bien informée a plus de raisons, ou peut-être même que la personne mal informée n'a pas de raison. Si les raisons sont subjectives et dépendent des connaissances de l'agent, oui. La personne, le randonneur mal informé n'a même pas de raison de fuir.
Alors voilà, alors ça ce serait une option, une option, mais elle ne, disons, le gros enjeu derrière, ce serait de se demander, même une fois qu'il y a une contrainte d'accès, est-ce que, étant donné que apparemment tout ce qui est important au niveau de l'accès aux raisons se passe en amont de l'émotion, est-ce qu'il y a vraiment une place pour dire que l'émotion joue un rôle indépendant et sui generis, si tu veux, dans la question de la justification du comportement? Alors ça, je pense que c'est vraiment... oui, c'est un sujet compliqué qui se lie directement avec la question de savoir qu'est-ce qu'on met dans le contenu d'une émotion en particulier. Si tu es prêt à, par exemple, comme certains, beaucoup, à dire qu'une émotion peut être déclenchée par des raisons non évaluatives, hein, par exemple, typiquement, ce qui va déclencher ta peur, ça va être la présentation visuelle d'un chien, pas le danger, mais d'un chien, juste un chien, etc. Et que tu dis c'est seulement l'émotion qui donne accès au danger, alors là, il y a une place pour aller plus loin que ce que tu étais tenté de dire. Je pense que c'est que comme ça qu'on peut faire. Si l'émotion est juste une réaction à de l'information que le sujet a déjà et indépendamment d'elle, en quelque sorte, alors son rôle justificateur est au mieux totalement indirect et dérivé.
Mais je me disais, par rapport à la théorie attitudinale, qu'il y avait peut-être une difficulté parce qu'il y a des asymétries entre j'ai peur du chien ou de l'ours, d'une part, et le rapport de cette émotion-là à la croyance que l'ours est dangereux ou effrayant, épeurant, et d'autre part, je crois que P et son rapport à la croyance que P est vrai. Il me semblait que si on prenait ces deux paires, en fait, on n'avait pas envie de dire la même chose. Donc, si on reprend départ, ton idée, comme tu l'as présentée, paraît tout à fait plausible. La propriété évaluative n'a pas besoin d'être représentée dans l'émotion. Comme dans la croyance, P n'est pas représenté quand tu crois qu'il il y a un déménagement, tu ne crois pas qu'il est vrai qu'il y a un déménagement, ce n'est pas nécessaire. Ce n'est pas la même chose.
Oui.
Tu peux ne pas avoir le concept de vérité, par exemple. Mais maintenant, il me semble qu'il y a une dysanalogie. Il faudrait que j'y réfléchisse plus parce que je ne suis pas encore sûre de voir exactement s'il y a vraiment une différence entre les deux paires suivantes. J'ai peur de l'ours et je crois que l'ours est effrayant. Ça, c'est par exemple, ça c'est une paire dont on veut dire que c'est possible que la peur te donne de l'information au sujet de quelque chose qui est vrai, donc elle est de evidence pour ta croyance que l'ours est effrayant. Tandis que si tu prends l'autre paire, je crois que P, ça c'est pas quelque chose qui te donne de l'evidence pour je crois que P est vrai. Il me semble qu'on n'a pas envie de dire ça. Et j'ai l'impression qu'il y a d'autres dysanalogies possibles. C'est beaucoup plus irrationnel, par exemple. C'est terriblement irrationnel de croire que P et de ne pas croire ou croire que P n'est pas vrai. Ça, c'est de l'irrationalité dramatique. Tandis que dans le cas, donc une autre dysanalogie possible, dans le cas, j'ai peur de l'ours. Mais je ne crois pas que l'ours est dangereux. C'est un peu irrationnel peut-être, mais c'est pas de l'irrationalité dramatique.
Alors, disons, oui. Alors ça dépend il y a un cas où, à mon avis, c'est très parallèle. Il y a beaucoup de cas où c'est totalement parallèle. C'est où on considère le rapport entre l'émotion et le genre de jugement que le sujet est prêt à faire n'est pas lié à des états perceptifs. Dans tous les cas où on a envie de dire il y a quelque chose de moins irrationnel dans une combinaison d'une émotion qui a à voir avec le danger là et puis l'absence de croyance de la part du sujet qu'il y a danger, c'est des cas typiques où la base cognitive de l'émotion est une perception visuelle. C'est assez lié au cas des blobs. Il me semble que l'intuition elle va plutôt dans l'autre sens, si on n'est pas dans des cas comme ça. Si le sujet a 3-4 raisons de penser que telle ou telle chose, disons, je ne sais pas, une situation qui va arriver demain ne présente aucun danger, mais qu'il continue à en avoir peur, ça ne me semble pas du tout clair qu'il est rationnel ou moins irrationnel que dans le cadre de la formation d'une croyance. Si il a une bonne série d'informations sur la base, par exemple, de croyances, dans ce cas précis, que les choses sont totalement sans safe, ce que tu veux, et que néanmoins il a peur, alors là, si on arrive à faire sens d'une situation comme ça, j'ai envie de l'évaluer de la même manière. Mais il est vrai néanmoins que je suis d'accord qu'il y a des cas d'émotion où, comme avec le blob, où la question de la rationalité du sujet ne peut pas se poser sur le rapport direct entre la base et le déclenchement de l'émotion, tout simplement parce qu'on a ce rapport extrêmement étroit. Donc je suis d'accord, je ne veux pas dire je veux surtout pas dire que le rapport entre une émotion et sa base est exactement le même, et en particulier au niveau de la normativité de l'épistémologie, que celui qu'il y a entre par exemple une présentation visuelle et puis une croyance. Je ne pense pas qu'il soit exactement similaire, mais par contre ce qui est vrai, c'est que dans les deux cas, tu as quelque chose qui est fondé sur quelque chose d'autre.
Il faudrait que je réfléchisse plus, mais il me semble que ce sont des asymétries qui montreraient qu'en fait, c'est faux de dire que la valeur n'est pas représentée dans l'émotion. Donc les jugementalistes auraient raison, les perceptualistes auraient raison, mais il faudrait que je regarde ça de plus près.
C'est-à-dire que c'est irrationnel, si c'est un type de perception. C'est ça l'idée.
Non. L'asymétrie entre les deux paires, j'ai peur que, et je crois, enfin les deux paires état, croyance avec le contenu qui est représenter les deux paires, donc le cas de l'émotion et le cas de la croyance que P, cette asymétrie me semble suggérer que le contenu est représenté dans le cas de l'émotion. Mais comme je dis, il faudrait que je regarde de plus près les différences. Il me semble que c'est quand même différent, qu'il y ait une asymétrie entre les deux paires. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions au sujet d'Anna Karénine?
Sur l'intentionnalité des émotions, le caractère intentionnel des émotions, est-ce que toute émotion est nécessairement dirigée vers un objet ou une situation particulière, ou l'objet peut être assez vague, assez mal défini, peut-être même mal connu du sujet? Je pense à des mélancolies, par exemple, ou à certains états mentaux que leur statut intentionnel, disons, n'est pas nécessairement très clair, très défini. Donc, voilà. Quel genre de modèle, ou quel genre de conception d'intentionnalité avez-vous besoin, dans le fond, pour que votre théorie marche comme vous voulez qu'elle marche? Quels sont les présupposés à ce niveau? Parce que je veux dire, c'est toutes des questions, dans le fond, qui sont largement débattues. Je veux dire, le statut des objets, a-t-on vraiment besoin d'un objet? Si oui, quel est le statut de l'objet? C'est un objet immanent? C'est un objet réel? Donc, justement, c'est intéressant parce que, contrairement à ce que normalement on dit des émotions, vous avez étudié des cas là, où on parlait d'objets fictionnels, donc c'est intéressant. Mais est-ce qu'on peut pousser encore plus loin puis parler d'émotions dans le cas où il n'y aurait peut-être même pas d'objet ou assurément pas d'objet facilement identifiable par le sujet. Donc, voilà.
Alors, je dirais, il y a une, disons, relative consensus aujourd'hui pour dire qu'il y a des états affectifs par objet, pas d'objet tout court, disons, ou des objets extrêmement larges et flous, mais ce ne sont pas les émotions, ce sont plutôt des humeurs. Et on fait la distinction entre les deux comme ça.
C'est bon, okay.
Mais alors, à l'intérieur des émotions elles-mêmes, c'est sûr que même si on accepte un critère comme ça, on va avoir des cas un peu frontières, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a beaucoup de cas où le contenu, l'objet de l'émotion est très large. On peut avoir peur d'un objet particulier, d'une classe d'objets, d'un groupe beaucoup plus large, etc., etc. Donc là, c'est certain que ce n'est pas forcément intentionnellement dirigé sur un objet très précis, ça peut être beaucoup plus large que ça. Mais normalement, le critère consiste à dire qu'il faut qu'il y ait une direction intentionnelle vers quelque chose d'autre, vers un objet spécifique, particulier, comme on dit des fois, pour que ce ne soit pas juste une humeur. C'est-à-dire particulier dans le sens où il n'y a pas seulement une représentation d'une valeur qui flotterait.
Et dans le cas des humeurs, il y aurait si vous voulez, une référence ou une visée intentionnelle, un acte intentionnel, mais il n'y aurait pas nécessairement de référent.
Il y a plusieurs options. Moi, j'aurais tendance à dire qu'il n'y a pas d'objet tout court. Il y a des gens qui considèrent que ce sont des objets beaucoup plus larges, comme des situations de vie globale, des choses comme ça. C'est ça l'objet qui est évalué positivement et négativement. Alors ça, c'est déjà une première chose. Ça, c'est encore juste l'intentionnalité, entre guillemets, de premier niveau. Après, il y a la question de savoir quelle est la manière dont le sujet peut avoir accès à l'objet. Et c'est pas forcément transparent. On peut avoir des épisodes d'affectifs qui ont, alors après, différentes théories sur ça, qui peuvent être intentionnellement dirigés vers l'objet d'une certaine croyance ou d'un certain jugement qui, pour une raison ou une autre, n'est pas particulièrement clair aux yeux du sujet lui-même. Donc, il n'y a pas de... Je veux dire, après ça va être une théorie de la conscience en général, et en particulier de la conscience ici, parce que ce qui se passe très souvent avec les émotions, c'est que le sujet a conscience d'avoir une émotion. Ça, il y a un accès pas trop difficile à ça, le fait d'être dans un état émotionnel, mais il y a un accès flou à la nature spécifique de cette émotion, est-ce que c'est une tristesse plutôt qu'une colère, etc. Et tout, et puis aussi à l'objet, qui peut être d'une manière ou d'une autre. Mais ça va être une théorie aussi de la réflexivité concernant les bases de l'émotion, plus que l'émotion elle-même, disons. Donc là, oui, alors tout ça, j'ai resté, à mon avis, totalement neutre, si ce n'est que j'ai présupposé que dans certains cas, les émotions pouvaient avoir des objets bien délimités.
S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, on va remercier Fabrice. Allez,
Merci.
un peu de